3 days after burying my wife, I was told I had inherited an abandoned mansion, a place she had never once mentioned in 50 years of marriage. In her final letter, there were only a few lines. Go alone. Don't let our son know. No explanation. No reason. When I stepped inside, buried in dust and time, everything had been left behind, except for one room that was impossibly clean. And when the fireplace shifted open, revealing a hidden space behind it, I froze, my chest tightening, because in that moment, I saw things come into the light, and there was no turning back. Thank you for being here. It means more than you know. Now tell me something. Where in the world are you right now, country, city? Wherever you are, leave it in the comments. That one comment means everything. Note this story weaves in fictional elements for narrative and educational depth. Resemblance to any name or place is unintentional, but what it has to say to you is worth hearing. 3 days after we buried Rose, the house still smelled like funeral flowers. White lilies, carnations, arrangements pressed into my hands by neighbors at the cemetery and set into vases I didn't remember owning. The scent had worked its way into the curtains, the couch cushions, the walls of the home Rose and I had shared for 31 years on Ridgewood Lane in Asheville, North Carolina. It was the smell of everyone else's grief, and it sat on top of mine like a second weight. I was standing in the kitchen doorway at 6:15 in the morning, wearing the same flannel shirt I'd had on for 2 days, staring at a counter buried under casserole dishes and pie tins with strips of masking tape on the lids. Brenda's chicken, Martha's potato salad. Don't forget the blue dish. The handwriting belonged to women from our church, women who had loved Rose the way Southern communities love their own, quietly, practically, with food. For 40 years, my hands had known exactly what to do. In an exam room, they moved with the confidence of someone who had listened to 10,000 heartbeats. But Rose had been the one who knew what to do in a kitchen, in a garden, in a life. Without her, I was a doctor with nowhere to put his hands. Outside the window, her rose bushes lined the back fence, the same as always. Deep red climbers, she'd coaxed up a trellis she built herself the spring after we moved in. They were still blooming. No one had told them to stop. I started clearing the counter, because it was the only task that required no decisions. Dish by dish, I moved things to the refrigerator until there was no more room, then stood at the sink, running water hot enough to steam the window. The backyard blurred into a wash of green and red. That was when I saw the notebook. Small, spiral-bound, pale blue cover worn at the corners. Rose's notebook. The kind she kept in her purse for grocery lists and phone numbers. It was sitting open on the kitchen table to a blank page, a pen laid across the spine. Every page inside was empty. Not torn out, not crossed through, just blank all the way through, as though she'd bought it for something she never had the chance to begin. I set it down and thought about Connor. He had left the morning before, 2 days after the funeral, appearing at my bedroom door at 7 a.m., with his coat already on and his keys already in his hand. Urgent situation at work, a timeline that couldn't wait. He was sorry. He'd call. He kissed my cheek and was gone before the coffee finished. What stayed with me was not the leaving. It was the moment at the graveside the morning of the funeral. Connor had stood very still beside the casket, not the stillness of grief, but the stillness of a man waiting for something to conclude. And once, just once, I had seen his gaze drop to Rose's left hand, where it rested against the white satin lining, to the thin gold band she'd worn for 50 years. He looked at that ring for a long moment, with an expression I couldn't name, and didn't want to examine too closely. My phone rang at 8:47, Mississippi area code. I almost let it go. Something made me answer. Is this Thomas Reed? A woman's voice, professional, measured, with deliberate warmth around the edges. It is. My name is Margaret Ellis. I'm an attorney based in Natchez, Mississippi. I apologize for calling so soon after your loss, Mr. Reed, but given the circumstances, I felt I couldn't wait. I pulled out a kitchen chair and sat down. What circumstances? I've been your wife's attorney for the past 12 years, she said. Rose retained me in 2012 with a very specific request. She wanted to establish a private estate kept entirely separate from your joint holdings and entirely separate from your son's knowledge. Outside, the cardinal that lived in Rose's rose bushes landed on the fence post, looked around once, and flew away. I wasn't aware Rose had separate legal representation, I said, but that was her intention. No apology in her tone, just the careful steadiness of someone who had been trusted with something heavy and was now finally setting it down. She left a property, Mr. Reed. A house called Reed Manor, located outside Natchez. It's been in her family for several generations. Under the terms of her will, it passes to you directly and exclusively. I've never heard of Reed Manor, I said. I know. Rose anticipated that. A brief pause. She left specific instructions for you. I'm going to read them exactly as she wrote them. I said I was ready. I was not. Margaret's voice shifted, less attorney, more messenger. Thomas. If you're hearing this, I'm already gone, and I wasn't able to tell you in person what I should have said years ago. I'm sorry for that more than I can write down. Go to Reed Manor. Go alone. Don't tell Connor. And when you get there, find the fireplace in the library. The kitchen went completely silent. We spoke for another 10 minutes. An address she would text me. A key that would be waiting. Paperwork she could handle remotely. I wrote none of it down because every word had already burned itself into the part of the brain that holds the things you cannot afford to lose. When I hung up, I sat without moving for a long time. Don't tell Connor. Find the fireplace in the library. 50 years of marriage. 50 years of shared dinners and shared beds and shared silences that felt like everything. And my wife had kept an attorney in Mississippi for 12 of those years without saying a word. I reached for my suit jacket draped over the back of the chair since the day of the funeral, untouched. I was going to hang it up. Some stubborn automatic impulse toward order. My hand went into the breast pocket the way hands do, checking by habit. My fingers found an envelope, small, sealed. My name on the front in Rose's handwriting, but not the confident script I knew from birthday cards and kitchen notes. This was compressed, pressed hard into the paper. The letters of my name written by someone with very little time and a great deal to say. I had no memory of this envelope. No memory of it being placed there. No memory of ever seeing it before this moment. I turned it over once. The seal was intact. The pen strokes in my name were uneven in a way Rose's handwriting never was, as though her hand had been trembling when she wrote it. I set it on the table next to the blank notebook and looked at them both. Whatever Rose had been trying to tell me, she had not wanted anyone else to hear at first. The envelope sat on the kitchen table for 3 hours before I finally opened it. I had carried it from the bedroom to the kitchen, set it beside the cold coffee I never drank, moved it once when I wiped down the counter, and then just stared at it under the low light of the corner lamp. Outside, Asheville had gone quiet. The church ladies' casseroles were boxed and stacked in the refrigerator. The roses on the windowsill were beginning to lose their petals one at a time, without drama, the way things you love tend to leave. I am a doctor. For 40 years, I read other people's test results across a desk and translated bad news into manageable language. I knew how to hold a patient's fear at arm's length and still be present for it. I thought that skill had made me a better husband. That night, sitting alone with Rose's letter, I began to wonder if it had simply made me a very convincing one. Her handwriting was smaller than I remembered, tighter, as though she had been rationing the space on the page. Thomas, I am sorry I kept this from you. I kept it because I knew you would try to fix it. And some things cannot be fixed by the right diagnosis or the right words at the right moment. Reed Manor has been in my family since 1941. I have been returning to it quietly for 12 years. Inside the library behind the fireplace, there is something I need you to find. Go alone. Do not tell Connor. Not yet. Trust me one last time. I read it twice. Then I set it flat on the table and pressed my hand over it, as if I could feel her pulse through the paper. Reed Manor, Natchez, Mississippi. 12 years of quiet returns, and she had never once said the name to me. I tried to be angry. I reached for it the way you reach for a glass in the dark, sure it is there, fingers closing on empty air. What came instead was a memory I had not examined in almost 2 years. The afternoon, Connor called me into the living room and suggested carefully that Rose's treatment might benefit from a specialist. Not our GP, not the oncology department at Mission Hospital where I had privileges and colleagues, a private physician. A Dr. Raymond Holt, 55 years old, trained at Vanderbilt, currently running a boutique oncology practice in Memphis. Connor had already researched him. Connor had already made a preliminary inquiry. You're retired, Dad. You're her husband. Let someone without the emotional weight handle the clinical side. You just be there for her. I had called it love. I had told myself it was my son looking after both of us, protecting me from a conflict of interest I was too close to see. So I stepped aside. I let Connor schedule the appointments. I let him sit in on consultations while I waited in the hallway with paper cups of bad coffee. Dr. Holt would emerge, shake my hand, and speak in the smooth, reassuring cadence of a man who understood that families needed simplicity more than they needed precision. Rose's numbers were stable. Rose was responding. Rose needed rest. Rose was in Memphis for 18 months, inpatient, outpatient, then inpatient again, returning to Asheville for stretches of 3 or 4 days at a time before Connor would arrange another transfer. I cooked for her during those visits. I slept beside her and listened to her breathe. I told myself the distance was medical necessity. I never once asked to see the original lab results. I am a doctor. It took me until 3 in the morning sitting alone in my own kitchen to understand what I had been. I folded her letter, slipped it back into the envelope, and went to bed. I did not sleep. The call came at 7:42 the next morning. Connor's name on the screen, the same as always, just his name, nothing else, because Connor had never been the kind of man who needed a photo. Dad, how are you holding up? I'm all right, I said. Getting through it. Good. That's good. A pause. The particular silence of a man choosing his next sentence. Margaret Ellis reached out to you, didn't she? The attorney from Mississippi. I stood very still at the kitchen window. The roses on the sill had dropped another ring of petals overnight. How do you know about Margaret Ellis? I asked. Mom mentioned her once, a long time ago. I just want to make sure you're not getting overwhelmed with paperwork on top of everything else. If there's an estate to manage, I can fly down and handle it. You shouldn't have to deal with all of that right now. His voice was careful, helpful. It had the same smooth, reassuring cadence as Dr. Holt's. I'll let you know, I said. Thank you, Connor. I ended the call before he could offer anything else. I stood at the window for a long time. Your mother mentioned her once. A long time ago. That was the explanation, and it was perfectly reasonable. And something about its reasonableness made the hair on the back of my neck rise the way it used to rise in the ER, when a patient's vitals looked almost normal. I looked at the roses, petals on the sill. petals on the counter. The ones still attached to the stems were holding on out of habit, not health. I went upstairs, pulled out my travel bag, and began to pack for Natchez. I left Asheville at 5:40 in the morning, before the streetlights had given up on the night. I did not sleep well. I did not expect to. I made coffee in the dark, poured it into a travel thermos Rose had bought me 3 Christmases ago, gray with a small blue stripe. The kind of gift that says I know you without ceremony, and I pulled out of the driveway before the neighbors were awake to wonder where I was going. The first hour belonged to the mountains. I-40 West curves through the edge of the Appalachians with the kind of beauty that demands nothing from you, and that morning I was grateful for it. The trees had begun to turn. Not the full blaze of October yet, just the first suggestions, a branch gone amber here, a cluster of rust at the crown of a poplar there. Rose used to say that September in the mountains was nature clearing its throat before the real performance. I had always agreed with her. I had agreed with her about most things. I was beginning to understand that agreement and attention are not the same. I stopped for gas in Jackson, Tennessee, just past 9. A Flying J off the interstate, the kind of place that smells like diesel and burnt coffee and exists purely to get people back on the road. I swiped my credit card at the pump, filled the tank, went inside for a bottle of water and a pack of peanut butter crackers, and was back behind the wheel in 11 minutes. A completely ordinary stop. I thought nothing of it at the time. Connor called somewhere south of Memphis around noon. When I-55 had flattened out into the long Mississippi straight away, and the landscape had traded mountains for cotton fields and water towers with small-town names painted on them in faded letters. "Hey, Dad, just checking in." His voice was easy, the voice he used at family dinners and hospital fundraisers, the one that made people lean in and feel seen. "I'm all right," I said. "Driving. Anywhere special? Going to see an old friend of Rose's, someone she mentioned in the letter." "Not a lie, not quite the truth." "Good. That's good for you getting out of the house." A pause, brief and smooth. "Let me know if you need anything." He hung up without asking where. Without asking whose friend, which letter, which city. I had prepared a vague answer for each of those questions. He did not ask a single one. I drove the next 40 miles, holding the steering wheel a little tighter than necessary, trying to decide which was worse, a son who asked too many questions, or a son who already knew the answers. By mid-afternoon, my lower back had begun to register its objections. I pulled off at a rest stop south of Brookhaven, walked 2 slow loops around the picnic area, and ate the crackers leaning against the hood of the car, while a family with 3 young children loaded back into a minivan nearby. The father caught my eye and gave me the weary nod of a man who had also been driving too long. I nodded back. The fellowship of the road. Rose used to sit facing south on the back porch every evening in September. I had noticed it for years, the way she would carry her tea outside and angle her chair just slightly, chin lifted toward the tree line as though she was listening for something below the horizon. I asked her once what she was looking at. "Just remembering," she said. I assumed she meant her childhood. Her family in Baton Rouge long gone. The particular gravity of southern autumn which pulls at you differently than it does in the mountains. I never asked which memory specifically. 49 years of marriage, and I had learned to read her silences as contentment. I was no longer certain that was what they were. I reached Natchez at 6:22 in the evening. The city came at me slowly, antebellum houses set back from oak-lined streets, the smell of the river somewhere close. The particular hush of a place that has already seen everything and is no longer surprised. I followed the directions Margaret Ellis had included in the envelope south on Cemetery Road. Left at the unmarked fork, follow the red gravel. The gravel track ran through a tunnel of overgrown magnolias for a quarter mile before the house appeared. Reed Manor rose against the darkening sky, like something that had decided long ago not to fall. 3 stories of Victorian Gothic iron railings gone rust orange, a wraparound porch swallowed by wisteria, tall, narrow windows sealed with grime and shadow. It had the look of a house that had been waiting for a specific person and had grown impatient. I sat in the car for a moment, with the engine off, listening to the ticking of the cooling metal. Margaret Ellis was already at the front gate, a trim woman in her 60s wearing a gray blazer despite the heat. She handed me a heavy key ring and a thick envelope with the quiet efficiency of someone completing a task assigned long before this moment. "Rose prepared for this day longer than you might think," she said. Nothing else, as if she had been instructed precisely on how much to say. I thanked her. She walked back to her car. I pushed open the gate and stepped onto the porch. The front door swung inward on a breath of stale wood and decades of quiet. And on the reception table in the center of the entrance hall, in a house abandoned for 25 years, sat a crystal vase of red roses. Fresh, petals tight, cut within the last 24 hours. Margaret had walked in from the gate beside me. She had not been inside. Someone else had been here first. As a doctor, I learned early that symptoms never appear without cause. You follow them, not the other way around. So instead of setting down my bag and finding a room for the night, I walked back toward the vase. The roses were red, deep, almost burgundy at the center, the petals still tight and cool to the touch. Cut recently within the day, certainly. The stems had been trimmed cleanly, not torn, and whoever arranged them had taken the time to strip the lower leaves. This was not an act of intimidation. It was an act of care. I carried that distinction with me as I moved through the ground floor, past the dust-covered furniture draped in yellowed sheets, past a parlor where the wallpaper had peeled away in long, curling strips, and into the kitchen at the back of the house. The rear door was unlocked. Not forced, the latch had simply been left open, the way you leave a door when you plan to return. Outside, the last of the afternoon light lay flat and amber across the garden. The lawn had gone wild years ago, but along the southern fence, someone had maintained a narrow bed of rose bushes with obvious intention. The canes were pruned, the soil recently turned, the color unmistakable, the same deep red as the roses on the table inside. The same variety rose grew in clay pots on our back porch in Asheville. A trail of footprints in the loose red dirt led away from the garden toward a gap in the rear fence. Fresh impressions, the tread distinct, the edges still sharp. Someone had walked this path within the last few hours. I followed them. The path ran behind a stand of old magnolias for roughly 200 meters, before opening onto a small clearing. A modest wood frame house sat at the edge of it, a caretaker's cottage, single story, with a vegetable garden to one side and a pickup truck that had not been new in 15 years parked out front. A man was crouched beside the rose bed along the cottage's south wall, working a pair of pruning shears with the focused patience of someone who had done this thousands of times. He heard me on the path before I reached the gate. He did not startle. He straightened slowly, one hand pressing briefly against his left knee as he rose, and turned to face me with the unhurried calm of a man who had been expecting this visit. He was 58, perhaps, with the build of someone who had once been physical and strong, and had reorganized himself around an injury. His left leg bore his weight reluctantly. His eyes, by contrast, were sharp and still. "I've been waiting for you," he said. "Rose told me you'd come." His name was Walter Gaines. He offered it along with a handshake that was brief and firm, and he did not pretend that my arrival was a surprise. I asked him about the roses on the table. "I put those there this morning," he said. "Every time I go inside, I bring flowers. Rose liked the place to smell like something living." He said it simply, without sentimentality. "The way you state a preference you have honored so long, it has become routine." Every time I go inside, I caught it immediately. "You have a key to the manor?" I said. "3 of them." He said it without apology. Rose gave me the first one in 2009, replacements twice since then. He had been maintaining the property for 15 years. Rose paid him monthly a bank transfer, regular as a utility bill, and asked nothing of him except that he keep certain things inside the house operational and that he stay. He said the word plainly, stay, not watch or guard or maintain. Stay, as though his presence itself was the assignment. "She never told you why?" I asked. "She told me enough," he said. "She told me the day would come when someone who needed to understand would walk down that path. She said to give him this." He reached into the front pocket of his work shirt and produced a small copper key, old heavier than its size suggested, with a simple bow and a shaft worn smooth from handling. He placed it in my palm without ceremony. I looked at it. No label. No explanation. I closed my fingers around it. "What does it open?" I asked. "She didn't tell me that part," he said. "She said you'd know when you found the right lock." I believed him. There was nothing in his manner that suggested concealment, only the particular economy of a man who had learned to hold information without being possessive of it. I asked him then what I had been working toward since I found the Rose bed, why Rose had chosen him specifically. Out of everyone, out of 15 years, and a monthly arrangement, and 3 sets of keys, why Walter Gaines, of Natchez, Mississippi. He looked down at his left leg, the way a person looks at something they have made a certain peace with, but do not enjoy explaining. He did not answer right away. When he looked back up, his expression had changed in a way I recognized from 20 years of patient consultations, the particular stillness of someone deciding how much of the truth to carry into the next sentence. "You're a doctor," he said. "You spent your career saving people." A pause. "But there was one you couldn't save. I think you still remember him." I had not told Walter Gaines I was a doctor. I had not told him my name until he offered his own. I had not told him anything at all. I stood at the edge of his garden in the fading September light, with a copper key in my hand, and no answer for what he had just said, only the cold, certain feeling that the man standing in front of me already knew far more about my life than I had given anyone in Natchez the chance to learn. I walked back into Reed Manor with Walter's copper key in my coat pocket, and a question I had not yet said aloud: how much had Rose arranged that I had never thought to ask about? The front hall was darker now. I had left the rear door open, and the last of the September light came through in a long, thin bar across the dusty floor, cutting the room in half. I stood in it for a moment, letting my eyes adjust, then moved toward the staircase on the left and turned north into the corridor Margaret's envelope had marked with a small, hand-drawn arrow. Third door on the right. The library. I pushed the door open and swept my flashlight across the room. My first thought was that I had walked into the wrong house. The rest of Reed Manor smelled like time and abandonment. Damp wood, crumbling plaster, the particular sourness of a place that has not moved air in years. The library smelled like neither. The shelves were clean. Not wiped down, once and forgotten clean, but maintained clean, the kind of cleanliness that requires regular attention. No film of dust on the upper shelves, no grime in the molding at the baseboard. The wide plank floor had been swept, and if I was reading the surface, correctly mopped within the past week. Walter's work, 15 years of quiet, consistent maintenance, and this room had received the most careful attention of all. I ran the flashlight along the shelves. The books were organized with a precision that had nothing to do with leisure. No novels, no histories, no collections of Southern poetry. Every spine I could read belonged to one of 3 categories: medical reference, corporate and contract law, or financial forensics. I pulled one volume from eye level, a 1994 edition of federal contract statutes, the kind of dry text that exists to be cited rather than read, and opened it to a page that had been flagged with a strip of yellow paper. Rose's handwriting filled the margin. Small, careful annotations in blue ink, some underlining, some bracketed, some circled with a notation I did not immediately understand. She had marked Section 3729 of the False Claims Act, which covers federal contractor fraud, and written beside it in letters slightly larger than the rest they knew the ground wouldn't hold. They signed anyway. I stood in the quiet library of an abandoned Mississippi manor, holding a federal statute annotated by my dead wife, and felt the specific vertigo of a man discovering that someone he thought he knew completely had lived an entirely parallel intellectual life. I replaced the book exactly as I found it. The fireplace was at the far end of the room, set into the north wall, between two tall windows with the shutters drawn. Italian marble, I thought, or a decent imitation, pale gray with darker veining, the kind of architectural detail that had been fashionable in the 1890s and had since outlasted everything around it. The firebox was clean. No ash, no soot, no waterline from rain intrusion. It had never been used, or it had been cleaned so thoroughly that the evidence had been removed. I crouched and ran the flashlight along the base. Below the iron grate, a narrow brass rail ran the width of the firebox, a decorative element at first glance, or a tool for managing the damper. I pressed it upward. It resisted, then moved with a soft metallic click and revealed a horizontal slot behind it no longer than 3 inches. I put the copper key in. It turned. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the entire left section of the fireplace surround marble-facing mantel bracket, all of it swung inward on a slow, heavy pivot, the way a door opens when it has been engineered to look like a wall. My phone rang. Connor. I let it go to voicemail and watched the gap in the wall widen to 18 inches. When the phone buzzed with his message a moment later, I set it face down on the nearest shelf without listening. Whatever he needed to say could wait. He had been deciding the timing of things long enough. I turned back to the opening. The air that came through was wrong for a room that had been sealed for decades. It was cool, not the damp cool of underground stone, but the controlled, even cool of a maintained interior. I have spent enough time in climate-controlled storage and hospital archives to know what intentional temperature regulation feels like. Someone had engineered this room to survive. I raised the flashlight and angled it through the gap. The beam caught the edge of a metal shelf, the curved neck of a lamp, a surface covered in objects I could not yet identify. And beyond it, against the far wall, the outline of a safe squat and dark, the dial facing outward, as deliberate as everything else Rose had placed in this house. The phone buzzed again. This time a text, not a call. Connor's message was 4 words. Call me, it's urgent. I looked at the gap in the wall. I looked at the phone. I put the phone in my pocket and stepped forward. The car stayed at the gate for 12 minutes before it left. I counted every second, an old habit, from 40 years of sitting beside hospital beds, watching monitors, waiting for numbers to move. When the headlights finally swept back up the gravel track and disappeared behind the magnolias at 21:26, I stayed in the dark room and kept counting. I watched the gate camera for another hour and 34 minutes. No second pass. No parking on the road beyond the tree line. At 23:00, I allowed myself to conclude that whoever had stopped out there had decided for tonight that stopping was enough. I stood up. My back had stiffened from the chair. I pressed both fists into my lower spine and walked a slow circuit of the room, checking each monitor in sequence the way I used to check vitals on a full ward, methodical, unhurried, looking for the one reading that didn't fit. Everything was still. I thought of what Walter had said. There was one you couldn't save, I think you still remember him. I had not answered him. I had stood at the edge of his garden holding a copper key and no words, and then I had walked back to the house because the alternative was standing there indefinitely. I still did not have an answer, but the question had been sitting at the edge of every thought since. I turned back to the shelving. In the far corner of the room, partially behind the cable rack, was a narrow chest of drawers, 3 drawers, steel-framed, the kind used in filing offices. The bottom drawer had a separate lock, smaller than the fireplace mechanism, the same gauge as a safety deposit key. I tried the copper key Walter had given me. It opened on the first turn. Inside, arranged in a shallow wooden tray, were 23 envelopes. Each one cream-colored, letter-sized, sealed. Each one addressed in Rose's handwriting to me, at our Asheville address, with a stamp in the upper right corner. Stamps that had never been canceled, envelopes that had never been postmarked, letters that had been written, prepared for mailing, and then kept. I sat down on the floor with my back against the steel shelf and began at the beginning. The first letter was dated March 2001. Rose's handwriting was rounder, then less compressed. I probably have this wrong, she wrote. I looked at Connor's quarterly reports again, and the numbers don't match the project timeline. Maybe I'm misreading them, but I don't think I am. She had signed it the way she signed birthday cards, just her name, no closing. As if she couldn't find a way to end a letter, she didn't know how to begin. The 2005 letter was 7 pages. She had confirmed by then that something was wrong. I'm not going to tell you which accounts or which projects yet, because if I tell you, you'll go straight to Connor and ask him directly. You've always done that, walk toward the problem with both hands open. I love that about you. It terrifies me right now. The 2010 letter was the one I read 3 times. Thomas, I know what Connor told you last year. He told you that Marcus Webb was confused, that the painkillers had affected his thinking, that grief does strange things to a man's memory. He was very convincing. He has always been very convincing. But you are not losing your mind, and Marcus Webb was not confused. He told you the truth in that emergency room, and Connor has spent the past 12 months making sure you would never be certain of it. I need more time. I need the kind of evidence that cannot be argued away. Please hold on. She had underlined that last sentence twice. I sat with the letter in my hands and let the room come back around me slowly. The hum of the equipment, the cool air, the blue light from the monitors. Marcus Webb, emergency room, 2009. The memory was there, the way old injuries are there, not painful at first contact, just present with an ache that deepens as you press on it. A night in late November. Rain so heavy the ambulance bay had flooded at the edges. A man brought in from a work site collapsed, both legs crushed, internal bleeding that we could not stop. I had been the attending. We had worked on him for 90 minutes. Before the end, when he was still conscious but barely, he had gripped my wrist. His lips had moved. I had leaned in close. Read construction, he had said. They knew. They knew the ground wouldn't hold. I had filed a report. I had included the patient's statement. 2 weeks later, Connor had sat across from me at our kitchen table and explained carefully and reasonably that Marcus Webb had a history of paranoid ideation, that the lawsuit his family had filed was being handled, that the trauma of the accident could produce false memories and misplaced blame. He had looked at me with the open, steady expression I recognized from his childhood, the one he used when he wanted me to understand something he considered important. I had withdrawn the report. I had told myself I was being responsible. Rose's letter said, "You are not losing your mind." I read the 2018 letter, which was the longest 12 pages describing Connor's methods, his shell accounts, his pattern of restructuring contracts, after site assessments. I read the 2022 letter last. It was brief. I'm nearly finished. One more piece. I'm sorry for the silence. I'm sorry for all of it. The date at the top was 6 weeks before the morning Connor had called to tell me Rose had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. I held the letter under the flashlight for a long time. I did not sleep that night. By the time the first gray light came through the gap beneath the library door, I had read every letter twice. I held the 2010 one in both hands and looked at the line Rose had underlined. Marcus Webb was not confused. He told you the truth. Walter had asked if I still remembered him. I did. By the time the clock above the equipment rack read 2300, I had satisfied myself that the car was not coming back. I turned off the monitor for the front gate, left the others running, and finally allowed myself to sit down, not at the console, but on the floor back against the steel shelf the way I used to sit in on-call rooms during the long stretches between emergencies. Walter's question had not left me. There was one you couldn't save. I think you still remember him. I had carried it through every room of this house since the previous afternoon, setting it aside each time a new piece of Rose's work demanded my attention, picking it back up the moment my hands were empty. I turned back to the shelving. In the far corner of the room, partially behind the cable rack, was a narrow chest of drawers. 3 drawers, steel-framed, the kind used in filing offices. The bottom drawer had a separate lock, smaller than the fireplace mechanism, the same gauge as a safety deposit key. I tried the copper key Walter had given me. It opened on the first turn. I already knew what was inside. I had spent the previous hours reading every one of them, 23 cream envelopes, each addressed to me in Rose's handwriting, each stamped and sealed and never sent. Now sitting on the floor with my back against the shelf and the last of the night around me, I read them again. Not because I had missed anything the first time. Because the second reading is where you stop looking for information and start understanding weight. The 2001 letter was the one that undid me first. Rose's handwriting was rounder, then less compressed, the hand of a woman who had not yet learned to write under pressure. I probably have this wrong, she had written. I looked at Connor's quarterly reports again, and the numbers don't match the project timeline. Maybe I'm misreading them, but I don't think I am. The first time I had read it, I had felt grief. The second time I felt the specific ache of a woman apologizing for her own accuracy, rationing her certainty into smaller portions so that it would be easier to dismiss. She had not been wrong. She had simply been early. The 2005 letter I held for a long time without reading. 7 pages, her handwriting more compact by then. The margin annotations beginning the habits of a woman who had started to understand that what she was building would need to survive scrutiny. I'm not going to tell you which accounts or which projects yet, because if I tell you, you'll go straight to Connor and ask him directly. She had known me that precisely, known the reflex I would have reached for, and why it would have destroyed everything she was trying to preserve. I set it down and picked up the 2010 letter. I had read it 3 times already. I read it a 4th. Thomas, I know what Connor told you last year. He told you that Marcus Webb was confused, that the painkillers had affected his thinking, that grief does strange things to a man's memory. He was very convincing. He has always been very convincing. But you are not losing your mind, and Marcus Webb was not confused. He told you the truth in that emergency room. And Connor has spent the past 12 months making sure you would never be certain of it. I need more time. I need the kind of evidence that cannot be argued away. Please hold on. She had underlined that last sentence twice. The second time through, I did not read for content. I read for the pressure of the pen. She had underlined it with the weight of a woman speaking to a man she trusted, to eventually hear her, not immediately, not when it was easy, but finally. The kind of trust that does not require acknowledgement to survive. The kind that waits. I had made her wait 15 years. The 2018 letter was the longest 12 pages. The second reading compressed it into something smaller and harder, a 12-year record of a woman doing alone and without recognition. The work that should have been shared. The shell accounts. The contract restructuring. The pattern she had traced from site assessments to subsidiary filings to Cayman transfers, following the thread through corporate architecture that had been designed specifically to make the thread invisible. She had found it anyway, and she had written it all down and sealed it and addressed it to me, and then kept it. Because she had understood that releasing it too early, without the right person in the right position, would only give Connor the opportunity to respond. The 2022 letter I set aside last, as I had the first time. Brief. The handwriting slightly larger than the letters before it, as though she had been writing it with tired eyes or in lower light, or simply with less time than she wanted. I'm nearly finished. One more piece. I'm sorry for the silence. I'm sorry for all of it. The date at the top was 6 weeks before the morning Connor had called to tell me Rose had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. I sat with that for a long time in the quiet of the room, the equipment humming steadily around me, the monitors casting their blue light across the shelves, and the folders and the 23 envelopes spread across the floor in front of me like a map of 20 years. She had known when she wrote it that she was nearly out of time. Not because of a cancer she did not have, because she had been working in secret for 2 decades, and the window was closing, and she still had one piece left to put in place. Walter had asked if I still remembered the man I hadn't been able to save. I did. I remembered his hand on my wrist. I remembered the particular quality of his voice barely sound more vibration than volume. A man spending everything he had left on a single sentence. Because he understood it might be the only one that mattered. Reed Construction. Not an accident. There are files. Lexington office. They knew the ground would go. I had heard him. I had reported it. And then I had let Connor sit across from me at my own kitchen table and explain in his careful, patient voice why the dying man's words could not be trusted. And I had believed him because believing him had been easier than carrying the alternative. Rose had carried it instead. For 15 years, she had carried what I had set down. I gathered the letters, carefully returned them to their envelopes, and placed them back in the tray in the order she had arranged them. I did not sleep. By the time the first gray light came through the gap beneath the library door, I had made a decision. Whatever Rose had left behind that lock, behind that safe, behind the red-taped envelope and the brown one, I was going to find it. And this time I was not going to let anyone explain it away. I owed her that. I owed Marcus Webb that. I sat in the blue light of the room Rose had built, with her handwriting on the shelves above me, and her 20 years of patience in my hands, and I waited for morning. The next morning, I made coffee from the thermos I had packed in Asheville and sat down in front of the safe. I had done this before, not with a safe, but with difficult cases. The ones where the chart was already full by the time I arrived, where other physicians had written their conclusions, and the family was waiting for confirmation. I had learned to sit with the file first, to breathe, to let the facts present themselves before I decided what they meant. Emotion is not the enemy of good medicine, but it is a poor diagnostician. That morning I needed to think like a doctor, not a husband. The safe was set into the wall behind the lower equipment rack, partially concealed by the rack's frame, visible only if you knew to look. It was a standard combination model, older but well-maintained, the kind installed in professional offices in the 1990s. The dial was clean. The mechanism turned smoothly. The combination was our wedding anniversary, June 14th, 1974. I knew it before I tried it, the way you know certain things about a person after 50 years, not because they told you, but because you understand how they think. The door opened. Rose had organized the contents the same way she organized everything by year, by category, with color-coded tabs along the top edge of each folder. She had been doing this for a long time, long enough that the earliest folders had yellowed at the edges and the ink on the oldest labels had faded to a gray-brown that required careful reading. I started with the section she had placed at the front. The folder was labeled in red Quarry Site 7, Harlan County, Kentucky, 2009. Inside were 47 pages incident reports, OSHA filings, coroner summaries, contractor records. 5 workers had died in a ground collapse on September 3, 2009. The official determination filed by the Kentucky Department of Labor 6 months after the event attributed the collapse to unforeseeable geological instability. Subsurface karst formation, the report said. An act of nature complicated by the particular limestone geology of that county. Rose had read every page. I could tell by the annotations, her handwriting in the margins, small and precise, flagging inconsistencies, the way I used to flag abnormal values on a lab panel. She had circled the date of the pre-construction soil survey, February 2009. She had drawn a line to a sentence in the engineering sub-report that described subsurface void detection as inconclusive and recommended supplemental bore testing before groundbreaking. That recommendation had been signed noted, and then Rose had highlighted this in yellow, overridden by a project authorization signed by Reed Construction's site director 4 days later. Across the top of the authorization in red ink, large enough that she must have pressed the pen hard into the page, "Not an accident." Below the OSHA, materials clipped together with a binder clip, was a separate document, a geological assessment commissioned after the collapse, not by the state, but by a private firm Rose had hired. The assessment ran to 18 pages and concluded in the careful language of expert witnesses who understand that precision is their only protection, that the void system beneath Site 7 had been identifiable using standard survey methods available at the time of construction, and that proceeding without supplemental testing represented a material deviation from accepted engineering practice. I set the folder down and looked at the wall for a moment. 5 men. The ground they were standing on had been assessed, found uncertain, and cleared for work anyway. The report said inconclusive. Someone had read that word and signed the authorization regardless. The bottom section of the safe held 2 items separated from the rest. The first was a brown envelope sealed with a label in Rose's handwriting, "Physical assets contents itemized inside." I set it aside. The second was a thicker envelope, cream-colored, sealed with a strip of red tape the width of a finger. The label read, 1987. Read this after you understand the quarry file. I held it for a moment. Then I placed it back in the safe, exactly where Rose had put it. She had written her instructions before she died, and she had been right about everything else. I would follow her sequence. I was replacing the quarry folder when Monitor 2 moved. The camera covering the east garden, the one angled toward the fence line along the property's eastern border. The image was clear in the morning light, sharper than the night footage. A figure stood on the outside of the fence, partially obscured by the overgrown hedgerow, but visible from the shoulders up. Dark jacket, still, looking toward the house, not Walter. Walter moved with the particular economy of a man who has reorganized his gait around an injury, one shoulder lower, a slight forward lean on each step. This person stood straight, different build, different posture, different quality of stillness. Walter's stillness was patient. This was the stillness of someone watching and deciding. 3 minutes and 14 seconds by the monitor's timestamp. Then the figure turned and walked north along the fence line toward the main road, disappearing into the tree cover without looking back. I saved the recording segment and sat with my hands flat on the console. 2 approaches in less than 12 hours. The car at the gate last night. The figure at the fence this morning. Neither had attempted entry. Both had been content to observe, which told me something. They were not yet certain enough to move. That window would not stay open indefinitely. I thought of Walter standing in his garden the previous afternoon, asking whether I still remembered the man I hadn't been able to save. He had known something then. He had been deciding how much to say. It was time to ask him directly. I closed the safe, pocketed the combination in my memory, the way I pocket a diagnosis I'm not yet ready to write down, and went back through the library to find my coat. I found Walter in the rear garden moving the hose slowly along the base of the rose bed, the way a man moves when he has nowhere urgent to be and has made peace with that fact. He heard me on the path and looked up. Not surprised. Not performing unsurprise either, just the steady acknowledgement of a man who had been expecting this conversation and had decided, somewhere in the years of waiting, that when it came, he would not waste time on preamble. "Marcus Webb," I said. "Who was he to you?" Walter set the hose down against the fence post and wiped his hands on his work pants. He looked at the rose bed for a moment, not avoiding my question, just finishing a thought, and then he told me. He had been shift supervisor on the night crew at Quarry Site 7 in Harlan County. Reed Construction had held the excavation contract since early 2009. Walter had worked for them for 11 years, by then long enough to know the difference between a contractor cutting corners on paperwork and one cutting corners on the ground you were standing on. In August of that year, he had submitted a written objection to the site foreman, and through him to the project manager about the shoring protocol in the lower shaft. The subsurface assessment had flagged void potential. The standard response was supplemental boring and a revised load distribution plan. What Reed Construction had approved instead was a cost reduction, thinner support columns, wider spacing, a schedule that did not allow time for the additional testing. Walter had put his objection in writing because he had learned across 11 years that verbal complaints disappeared and written ones did not. He was terminated the following week. "Personnel matter?" the letter said. "Restructuring." 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning in early September, the lower shaft of Site 7 collapsed during the day shift. 5 men were inside. None of them made it out. Walter stopped speaking for a moment. The Mississippi morning was quiet around us, mockingbirds somewhere in the magnolias, the slow sound of water still running from the hose against the fence post. Marcus was day shift," he said. "He wasn't even supposed to be in that section. He went down to check on a younger kid who was nervous about the bracing. He had heard from Marcus's wife within the hour. He had driven straight to Asheville Memorial Hospital and arrived in time to be told that Marcus was in surgery and the outcome was uncertain. He had sat in the waiting room for 6 hours. By the time Marcus was out of surgery, Walter had been told that family only were permitted in the ICU. That was where I had been. I told Walter what I remembered, not the clinical details which I had written in the chart and filed in the proper sequence, but the other part. The part that had no place in a chart. It was late November 2009 by then. Marcus had lasted longer than anyone expected, nearly 8 weeks after the collapse, most of it unconscious or barely present. I had been the attending on his final night. The nurse called me at 11:40 because his pressure had begun to drop in the particular graduated way that means you have perhaps 2 hours, perhaps less. I sat beside him. I had done this many times. There is a specific quality to a room where someone is dying that I cannot explain to anyone who has not experienced it, a change in the air, a narrowing of everything that is not essential. At some point after midnight, Marcus opened his eyes. He turned his head toward me slowly, with the deliberate effort of a man moving against a current, and his lips moved. I leaned close. "Reed Construction," he said. His voice was barely sound, more vibration than volume. "Not an accident. There are files. Lexington office. They knew the ground would go." Then he closed his eyes. and he did not open them again. I filed a report with the Asheville Police Department the following morning. I included Marcus's statement, verbatim noted the time, the witnesses present, the patient's level of consciousness at the moment of the statement. I was as precise as I knew how to be. 3 weeks later, a detective called to tell me the investigation had been closed. The official findings were consistent with geological accident. No evidence of negligence. 2 days after that, Connor came to dinner. He sat across from me at the kitchen table with a folder of documents, the official investigation report, the OSHA determination, a personnel file for Marcus Webb that included 2 prior disciplinary notices and a note from a company physician about alcohol use during a site visit. He laid them out one at a time, the way a teacher presents evidence in sequence, and he spoke to me in the patient voice he used when he wanted me to understand something important. Marcus Webb had a history of confused reporting, Connor said. The trauma of the accident combined with the medications administered in intensive care could produce false certainty in a person's memory. Filing a secondary complaint based on the delirious statement of a dying man would constitute defamation. His legal team had been in contact with the department. They would be monitoring the situation. Then he looked directly at me. "Mom hasn't been well lately, Dad." His voice did not change. "If this becomes a public matter, the stress won't be good for her. You know that better than anyone." I withdrew the report. I had told myself it was the right decision, that I was protecting Rose, that the official findings were thorough, that my certainty about what I had heard in that room might be the thing that was wrong. I had been telling myself that for 15 years. Walter listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, he nodded once, not in surprise but in the recognition of a man hearing confirmation of something he had always known. In 2010, he said, "Rose came to find me. She knew everything, including what Connor had said to you that night. She said, 'Walter, I need you to stay here and wait. We are going to do this the right way.'" He picked up the hose and turned off the water at the spigot. "There's one more person you need to meet," he said. "But she'll come to you when she's ready." I looked at him. "She," I said. He said nothing else. He did not need to. There was only one woman in Connor's life. I had never been permitted to understand, and standing in that garden with the morning mist still on the grass, I began to wonder what she had been permitted to understand about us. In medicine, we call it a syndrome, the moment when a collection of unrelated symptoms suddenly resolves into a single coherent diagnosis. Not a new fact necessarily. The same facts, finally arranged in the right order. That afternoon, sitting in the cool blue light of the communications room with the safe open on the wall beside me, I saw Connor's syndrome for the first time. I had returned from the garden and gone straight back to work. Walter's words had settled into me the way a difficult truth settles not with violence, but with weight, occupying space until you reorganize everything around it. I had given myself 10 minutes to stand at the library window and look at nothing. Then I went back to the safe. The folder I had not yet opened was blue-positioned behind the quarry materials labeled in Rose's handwriting, "Surrounding Properties, 2017 to 2023. Inside was a cadastral map, a land survey document the kind used by county assessors to track property boundaries and ownership records. It covered a 6-mile radius around Reed Manor, printed on large format paper and folded into quarters. Rose had unfolded it and refolded it so many times that the crease lines had softened into fabric. She had been studying this document for years. The map was marked. Every parcel of land within half a mile of Reed Manor's boundary had been outlined in blue ink with a notation. In the margin, a company name, a purchase date, and a filing number. The purchases ran from 2017 to 2023, systematic and patient, working outward from the property lines the way you clear a perimeter. 14 separate parcels, 14 separate transactions, 14 different company names. I recognized none of them. That was the point. Rose had done the work that I would not have known how to begin. Each company name had a corresponding card in a small index box she had clipped to the inside cover of the folder name. Delaware registration number, registered agent, date of incorporation. I pulled the first card, Meridian Property Partners, LLC, registered in Delaware, March 2017. Registered agent listed as a service company in Wilmington. No website, no physical address beyond the registered agent, no officers listed beyond the statutory minimum. I pulled the second card. Different name, same structure. Different date, same registered agent service. By the seventh card, I understood what I was looking at. Rose had traced them herself using a combination of Delaware's Public Corporate Registry, Mississippi County land records, and what appeared to be a hand-drawn chain of ownership diagram she had constructed on the back page of the folder. Her handwriting became smaller and denser toward the center of the diagram, the way complex things contract as you get closer to their core. At the center, she had written 3 words and circled them twice. Magnolia Land Holdings, LLC. Below it, in a different ink, added later, I thought, because the color was slightly darker. Third-tier subsidiary of Reed Construction. Registered agent, personal counsel to Connor Reed. Beneficial owner Connor Reed. I sat back and looked at the map. Reed Manor sat at the center of the outlined parcels like a gap in a completed puzzle. The one piece that had not yet been acquired, surrounded on every side by land that now, in effect, belonged to my son. He had been doing this for 7 years. Quietly, systematically, through layers of corporate structure designed to make the pattern invisible to anyone who was not specifically looking for it. Once at a family dinner, I could not place the year precisely, sometime in the early 2000s, Connor had mentioned, in the context of a conversation I had not been paying full attention to, that he was interested in Mississippi real estate development. Undervalued markets, he had said. Long-term infrastructure potential. I had nodded and passed the bread and thought nothing of it. I thought about it now. My phone buzzed on the equipment shelf where I had left it face down. I turned it over. Connor. Not a call this time. A text message, Dad, I'm getting worried. You haven't been in touch. Where are you? The concern in the phrasing was perfectly calibrated, present enough to read as genuine, vague enough to contain no information. It was the same voice he had used at the kitchen table in 2009, laying out the personnel file explaining Marcus Webb's history of confused reporting. The voice of a man who understood that the best way to control a situation was to appear to be managing it on behalf of someone else. I set the phone back down without responding. I returned to the map and read Rose's diagram from the outside in 14 companies each, a thin legal membrane, each pointing back toward Magnolia Land Holdings, each pointing further back toward Reed Construction, each pointing finally to Connor. 7 years of patience and incorporation fees and registered agents in Delaware, all circling one piece of property in Natchez, Mississippi that he did not own and could not force, because Rose had put it beyond his reach. And now it was mine. I folded the map back along its original creases and replaced the folder in the safe. As I did, the corner of the map caught and lifted, and I turned it over. On the back, in Rose's handwriting, in red ink, written more heavily than anything else in the room, the kind of pressure you apply when you want the words to carry weight beyond the page. Why does Connor need this land at any cost? Read the 1987 envelope, but read my medical file first. I stood with the map in my hands. Her medical file. I had assumed the brown envelope I had set aside, labeled physical assets, contained the inventory of gold and stock certificates. I had not looked further. I went back to the safe and examined the remaining contents more carefully. Behind the physical assets envelope tucked flat against the back wall was a manila folder I had missed entirely. Medical records. Rose Eleanor Reed, for Thomas only. I held it in both hands for a long moment. Outside, somewhere in the direction of the front gate, I heard a car door close. Before I show you what was inside, Rose's second folder comment, 1987, right now. Just that number. Because what Thomas is about to read about the woman he shared 50 years with will break something open that cannot be closed again. This story contains fictional elements crafted for reflection. If that's not for you, step away now. But if you're staying, don't look away. I brought the medical folder to the work table and opened it under the desk lamp. In medicine, the first rule of diagnosis is this: never rely on a single source. Cross-reference everything. A symptom confirmed by one test means something. The same symptom confirmed by 3 independent tests with consistent results across different methodologies means you can act. Rose knew this rule as well as I did. She had lived with me for 50 years, and she had learned to think like the man she married, carefully, sequentially, and with a deep distrust of information that arrived pre-interpreted. She had left me 2 folders. The first was labeled in her handwriting, Records Official Version. The second, Records Truth. I started with the official version. The file contained 18 months of documentation, lab panels, imaging reports, oncology consultation notes, treatment summaries, all formatted on Meridian Oncology Center letterhead, all signed by the same hand, Dr. Raymond Holt, MD Board, Certified Oncology. I read the first panel slowly, then the second, then the third. I am not an oncologist, but I practiced medicine for 4 decades, and I understand laboratory values the way a musician understands pitch, not always able to name every technical element, but immediately aware when something is off. Pancreatic cancer is not a stable disease. It progresses. It responds unevenly to treatment. The CA-19-9 marker fluctuates sometimes sharply between draws. The bilirubin climbs and dips in response to biliary involvement. A real patient's chart over 18 months looks like weather variable, occasionally dramatic, tracking the disease's own logic. Rose's official records looked like a controlled study. Every value within range. Every fluctuation small and symmetrical. Every treatment response exactly proportionate. 18 months of data with the statistical variance of a textbook example. No real patient looked like this. Not one. I set the folder down and pulled up the medical licensing database on my phone. It took 4 minutes to find what I was looking for. Dr. Raymond Holt had had his license suspended by the Tennessee Medical Board in 2019, insurance fraud, specifically the falsification of diagnostic documentation to support billing claims. He had paid a substantial fine, completed a compliance program, and had his license reinstated in 2021 with conditions. Connor had introduced him to us in the spring of 2022. I placed the official folder face down on the table and opened the second one. Rose's handwriting filled the first page, not the tight, compressed script of her letters to me, but something looser and more deliberate, the hand of a person writing for the record. Thomas I. was never diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. The diagnosis was fabricated by Raymond Holt at Connor's direction. Connor believed this would accomplish 2 things: give him control over my medical information and create the conditions under which I might die of natural causes before I completed my work here. He underestimated how long I had already been working. She had not been in Memphis for 18 months. She had been here at Reed Manor in this room, using the time that Connor believed she was spending in a treatment facility to finish the documentation I had been reading for the past 2 days. She had returned to Asheville for 3 or 4 days every 3 weeks, during which she had allowed herself to look unwell, eating less, moving slowly, wearing the particular expression of a woman in the middle of something difficult. It had not required much acting. She had been in the middle of something difficult for 20 years. The final page of the folder was a single sheet written in larger letters than the rest, as if she had wanted to make sure I could read it without my glasses. Thomas, I am sorry for the way I did this. Not for doing it, only for the way. Connor arranged Holt. He thought the diagnosis would keep me close and distracted, and that if I deteriorated naturally, the property transfer would be delayed long enough for his plans to proceed. He did not know I had already finished. I did not expect my heart to give out before I could tell you myself. I am sorry for that most of all. I set the page down on the table. For a moment, I did not move. The equipment hummed around me. The monitors showed the empty gardens, the still gate, the quiet caretaker's path. 49 years of mornings. 49 years of the particular rhythm of her presence coffee before I was awake. The sound of her reading in the next room, the way she always knew when I was troubled before I said a word. She had spent the last 2 years of her life alone in this house building the case that would outlast her. And she had come home every few weeks and sat across from me at the kitchen table and let me believe she was dying by inches. She had done it to protect me. I do not cry easily. It is an occupational habit, 40 years of practicing the separation between what you feel and what the room requires of you. But there in the communications room with the desk lamp throwing a small yellow circle on her final letter, I put my face in my hands and let it come. I allowed myself exactly the time it took. Then I folded the page, carefully replaced both folders in the safe, and closed the door. I pulled the fireplace surround back into position until I heard the latch engage. I straightened the iron grate. I stood in the library for a moment in the quiet and made sure there was nothing visible that should not be visible. Then the knocking came. 3 slow, deliberate strikes against the front door, not urgent, not hesitant. The knock of a man who is accustomed to being let in. Dad. Connor's voice calm and clear through the old wood. I know you're in there. Your car is parked out front. I looked at the fireplace. I looked at the door. I picked up my coat from the chair where I had left it and walked out of the library to meet my son. There are conversations that require you to close one door before you open another. I had closed the fireplace. I had pocketed the key. I had walked through the library and down the corridor to the front door. And by the time I turned the handle, I had arranged my face into the expression of a man who had driven 9 hours to sort through his dead wife's estate and was mildly surprised and genuinely glad to see his son. Connor stood on the porch in a charcoal jacket, a travel bag at his feet, looking exactly as he always had, composed, well-dressed, the kind of man who moves through the world as though it has been expecting him. He smiled when he saw me, and the smile was warm, and I knew every register of it. Dad. He stepped forward and embraced me briefly. I've been trying to reach you. I was worried. I needed some quiet, I said. You know how I get. He nodded as though that explained everything, and perhaps it did. He told me how he had found the address, a letter in Rose's home office, he said, something he had come across while helping to organize her papers after the funeral. His voice was smooth and regretful as he said it, the voice of a man performing a difficult kindness. I listened and said nothing that disagreed with him. Inside, he looked around the entrance hall with the careful, neutral attention of a man taking inventory without wanting to appear to do so. His eyes moved to the parlor door, the staircase, the corridor toward the back of the house. They did not move to the library door at the far end of the hall. He was trying not to look at the thing he had come for, which told me he still did not know exactly where it was, only that it was somewhere in this building. We sat in the parlor on 2 chairs I had cleared of their dust covers that afternoon. Connor leaned forward with his elbows on his knees in the posture of a man being frank. I've spoken with a firm, he said. A development group out of Atlanta. They're prepared to make a serious offer for the property fair market value, possibly above. I can have their people here within the week. This is a difficult time, Dad. You shouldn't have to manage an estate on top of everything else. What firm? I asked. He named one I didn't recognize. I filed it away. They specialize in historic properties, he said. Restoration, adaptive reuse. It's a good outcome for a house like this. And for you? I asked. What's your interest in it? He smiled again, the same warm register. I just want it handled. For both of us. I told him I would think about it. I told him I was tired from the drive and needed sleep. I told him there was a motel in town and gave him the name Margaret Ellis had written on the back of her card. He accepted this without pushing another tell, from a man who had decided that pressure tonight would cost him more than patience. At the door, he turned back once. Don't sign anything without talking to me first, he said. It was framed as advice. It was not advice. Of course, I said. I watched his rental car reverse down the red gravel track and disappear into the magnolias. Then I went back inside and stood in the hall for a moment in the dark. My hands were completely steady. 40 years of keeping your face neutral while delivering terrible news leaves a particular residue, a capacity for stillness that has nothing to do with peace. I went back to the library. It was past 11 when I finally opened the 1987 envelope. The document inside was 8 pages typed on paper that had yellowed at the edges but remained legible throughout. A contract, formal and dense with the specific language of mineral rights agreements, party designations, legal descriptions of acreage subsurface extraction parameters. The parties were Reed Construction, represented by Connor James Reed as sole authorized signatory, and Forsyth Natural Resources Limited, a corporation, registered in Ontario, Canada. Connor had been 21 years old when he signed it. The agreement conveyed subsurface mineral extraction rights across 14 parcels of land in Adams County, Mississippi, including the parcel legally described as Reed Manor and its associated grounds to Forsyth Natural Resources for a term of 38 years, with automatic renewal provisions triggered by consolidated land ownership. The consideration listed was nominal $400,000 paid to Reed Construction. Rose had attached a separate document behind the contract, a wire transfer record printed on banking paper, showing a transfer of $3.2 million from a Forsyth subsidiary account to a private account in the Cayman Islands. The account holder's name had been redacted on the original, but Rose had typed it on a separate card and clipped it to the page C.J. Reed Personal Account, established 1986. I sat with that for a long time. 5 workers in Harlan County had found something in a site archive, a filing that referenced mineral rights, a subsidiary connection, a trail that led back to this contract. They had died because of what they found. Marcus Webb had tried to tell me in his final hour. Connor had spent 15 years making sure I would doubt what I had heard. Below the contract documents, wrapped in a cloth and sealed inside a fireproof inner case, was what Rose had described as resources. I counted 47 gold bars, each smaller than a standard bank vault brick 10-ounce commercial bars, the kind issued by licensed refiners, each stamped with an assay mark and a serial number. 470 troy ounces in total. At current market rates, enough to matter. Beside them in a flat archival envelope were 3 sets of stock certificates, paper signed, each representing a significant position in companies still listed on the New York Stock Exchange. Rose's note was tucked beneath them. Not for wealth, for staying power. Connor controls money. I want you to have enough that he cannot simply wait you out. I replaced everything, closed the safe, and sat down in the wooden chair by the monitoring equipment. The automatic renewal clause ran on a separate page near the back of the contract. I had almost missed it. Consolidated ownership of all 14 parcels confirmed by deed before December 31st, 2025. would trigger a 30-year extraction term without requiring additional signatures from any party. The date on the clock above the equipment rack read 2:14 a.m., 15 months. Connor had been circling this property for 7 years because he needed it before the end of 2025. 15 months was not a long time, not for a man with his resources and his patience, but it was enough time to make a mistake if I moved before he expected me to. And now he was 11 miles away in a motel room, believing I knew nothing, planning to return in the morning with a contract I was supposed to sign. I looked at the monitors. The gate was still. The garden was quiet. Walter's light was off. I was done waiting. I did not sleep. That was not a problem. I had spent enough nights awake in hospital corridors waiting for test results, waiting for a patient to stabilize, waiting for the particular moment when a situation resolves itself one way or another, to know that sleeplessness and incapacity are not the same thing. By 4 in the morning, I had a working outline. By 6, I had made coffee from the last of the thermos and gone over it 3 times. By the time the September sun had burned the mist off the rear garden, I was standing at the library window watching Walter move through the rose bed with his pruning shears, and thinking about what Walter had said 4 days ago in the fading afternoon light. There's one more person you need to meet. She'll come to you when she's ready. I had assumed ready meant soon. I had not assumed it meant this morning. I saw her before she saw me. A woman coming through the side gate, the narrow wooden one set into the south wall of the garden, not the iron gate Connor had used the previous evening. She was 44 perhaps, with the particular posture of someone who has been careful for a very long time, shoulders slightly inward, head angled just enough to maintain visibility in all directions without appearing to look. Her eyes were red at the rims. Her hands, when I could see them, were not entirely still, but her stride was. She walked like a woman who had made a decision and was not going to renegotiate it on the way to carrying it out. Walter looked up from the rose bed when she came through the gate. He did not appear surprised. He gave me a single slow nod through the window, the gesture of a man confirming what he already knew, and then returned to his work as though nothing had changed. Rose had arranged this too. I went to the back door and opened it before she reached the step. Then Dad, Thomas. Her voice was quieter than I expected and steadier. Rose contacted me last year. There's something I need to tell you. Her name was Diana Walsh Reed. I had met her at holidays and the occasional family dinner for 18 years, and in all that time I had read her the way you read a patient whose chart is controlled by someone else partially through filtered information, never quite certain you were seeing the complete picture. She had always been courteous and composed. She had always deferred to Connor in the particular way that can look like partnership and is sometimes something else entirely. Standing in the rear doorway of Reed Manor on a September morning, I looked at her with my full attention for perhaps the first time. I invited her inside. We sat in the kitchen, the one room I had managed to make briefly habitable, with 2 folding chairs and a surface cleared of dust. She held her coffee cup in both hands and told me what she knew. In 2015, at a company event in Charleston, Connor had drunk more than she had ever seen him drink. On the drive home, somewhere on the I-26 in the early hours, he had talked. She was not certain he remembered telling her in the morning. She had never asked. He had described a site in Harlan County. 5 men. A decision that had been made before the concrete was poured. He had not used the word accident. He had used the word managed. Diana had lived with that word for 9 years. She described those years with the measured, factual tone of someone who has rehearsed the telling in order to get through it without stopping the steady erosion of her financial independence. The monitoring of her phone, the way her friendships had narrowed to the ones Connor found unthreatening. She had thought more than once about leaving. She had not, because she had not had anything she could take with her that would be enough. Then, in August of 2023, Her phone had rung from a number she didn't recognize. It was Rose. They had met at a coffee shop in Charlotte, a place Diana had chosen, near a hotel where she had told Connor she was visiting a college friend. Rose had been thinner than Diana remembered. She had ordered tea and drunk none of it. She had not wasted time on preamble. "I know what you heard in 2015, Rose had said, and I know what it has cost you to carry it. When Thomas comes to Reed Manor, go to him. Bring everything you've collected." Diana reached into the inside pocket of her jacket and placed a USB drive on the kitchen table between us. It was small and black, with a strip of white tape along the side on which she had written a date range in pencil: September 2022, August 2024. "I've been recording him," she said. "In the house in the car. Mississippi allows it, I checked. One party is enough. I'm the one party." She paused. I didn't know what else to do. I needed something real, something that couldn't be explained away. I looked at the drive. Then I looked at her. She had lived inside this secret for 9 years. She had endured the narrowing and the monitoring and the specific loneliness of knowing something you cannot say. And instead of finding a way out for herself alone, she had waited until she had something that would matter. She had collected 2 years of recordings. She had driven to a coffee shop in Charlotte and agreed to be part of a plan made by a woman she barely knew, because the woman had looked at her and said, "I know what it has cost you." I picked up the drive and put it in my coat pocket. "Thank you," I said. It was not adequate. I said it anyway. She nodded once, and the tension in her shoulders shifted, not gone, but redistributed the way a weight moves when a second person takes part of it. Then, from beyond the house, from the direction of the front gate, the sound of tires on red gravel, Diana went still. The color left her face in the specific, rapid way of someone whose body has learned to treat certain sounds as signals. I was already standing. "Go inside," I said, and I meant the library, the corridor, the back of the house where Connor would not go without knowing what he was looking for. "Go with Walter." She moved without hesitating. I watched her cross the kitchen and disappear into the corridor, and then I straightened my jacket and walked toward the front of the house. Yesterday, I had opened that door with the face of a man who knew nothing. Today was different. Before I opened the front door, I reached into my coat pocket and pressed the small black remote Walter had shown me the previous afternoon. One button, no indicator light. The kind of device designed to be operated without looking at it. Somewhere behind the library wall, the recording unit's hard drive began to spin. In 40 years of practice, I had learned that patients tell the truth most readily when they do not know they are being listened to. The man coming up the porch steps was not a patient, but the principle held. I opened the door. Connor was dressed the same as the night before: charcoal jacket, unhurried posture, the expression of a man managing a minor inconvenience. He carried a leather folder under one arm. He smiled when he saw me, and the smile was the same smile. And I had spent enough of the last 48 hours studying his face on a recording monitor to know exactly how much of it reached his eyes. "Morning, Dad. Sleep okay?" "Well enough," I said. "Come in." We went to the parlor. I had arranged 2 chairs facing each other across the low table, the same configuration as the night before, but I had moved mine 3 inches closer to his, a small adjustment. I wanted him to feel the proximity without being able to name why the room felt different. He opened the leather folder and laid 2 documents on the table. The first was a purchase agreement, Reed Manor and associated grounds buyer, listed as Meridian Heritage Properties, LLC. Consideration of $800,000 transfer to be completed within 30 days. The second was a letter of intent on company letterhead, signed by someone whose name I did not recognize. The amount was above what any reasonable market appraisal would produce for a condemned property with no utilities. "That's a strong offer," I said. They move fast when they want something, he said. And this property fits a very specific need for them. Historic preservation, adaptive reuse. You'd be doing the house a favor. I picked up the purchase agreement and read it as though I were considering it. I turned the pages slowly, the way I used to turn a chart in rounds when I wanted a resident to think I was still deciding. What's their actual interest in the land? I asked. Not the house, the land specifically. A small pause, calibrated but present. Development potential, he said. The whole corridor is undervalued. They're buying adjacent parcels as well. Adjacent parcels, I said. How many? I'm not certain of the exact number. Magnolia Land Holdings bought 14, I said. Over 7 years, all pointing back to Reed construction. The room did not change temperature, but something in it shifted. Connor's hands were still on his knees. His face did not move, but his jaw had tightened by one small degree, the way a jaw tightens when a man is deciding what the situation now requires of him. I don't know where you heard that, he said. Harlan County, Kentucky, I said. September 2009, Quarry Site 7, 5 men. Silence. I waited. It was a skill I had developed over decades, the capacity to sit in silence and let the other person decide what to do with it. Consultations are won in the pauses. The patient who fills the silence is the patient who tells you what you needed to know. Connor filled it. You should be careful, he said. His voice had dropped the warmth, fully absent now. You're an old man alone in a condemned building in a state you've never spent time in. Whatever you think you found here, papers, old files, whatever rows left, none of it is what you think it is. Documents can be explained. Memories can be challenged. He leaned forward slightly. Sign the agreement, Dad. Go home. That's the best advice I can give you. Marcus Webb, I said, his chin lifted. 1 degree, no more. But I had delivered enough terminal diagnoses to recognize the moment a person understands that the thing they feared most has arrived. He told me, I said, in the emergency room, November 2009. You told me he was confused. You told me Rose couldn't take the stress of a public dispute. I withdrew the report because I believed you. I paused. I don't believe you anymore. How? You're making a mistake. The voice was nearly a whisper now. Controlled and low and specific, the voice of a man communicating something he does not want recorded. You're alone here. No one knows where you are. Don't make this more complicated than it has to be. I looked at my son. For a moment, I simply looked at him, at the man who had learned to ride a bicycle in a hospital parking lot on a Sunday morning, who had cried in a waiting room when his daughter was born, who had sat across from me at a kitchen table in 2009 and explained with great patience and apparent love why the dying man's words should not be trusted. Everything has been recorded, I said, from the moment you came through that door this morning. He went very still. Then he stood, picked up the leather folder, and walked to the front door without speaking. On the porch, he stopped and made a phone call, one hand cupped around the receiver back to me. I could not hear the words. The call lasted 40 seconds. Before he got into the car, he turned and looked back at the house. His gaze traveled the front face of the building window's eaves, the line of the roof. Then it moved to the left, toward the wing that contained the library. It stayed there for 3 seconds. He knew. Not the location precisely, not the mechanism, but he knew the thing he had come for was somewhere behind that wall. He had known it since March 2021, when he had stood in the entrance hall and looked at the fireplace and walked away. He had simply never found it. He got into the car and drove back down the gravel track. I stood in the entrance hall and listened to the sound of the engine fade into the magnolias. and I thought about what a 40-second phone call meant, and who might be on the other end of it, and how much time I realistically had before whatever he had just set in motion arrived at this gate. Not much. I went to find Walter. Rose had waited 20 years. Walter had waited 15. Diana had waited 9. And I had waited 15 years since the night Marcus Webb whispered into my ear in that emergency room, since the morning I withdrew the report, since every quiet dinner and holiday visit, during which I had looked at my son and chosen again and again to believe in the version of him I needed to be true. Enough. I found Walter in the rear garden, where he had been since Connor's car disappeared down the gravel track. He had not gone back to his cottage. He had simply waited, the way he always waited, with the patient-rooted stillness of a man who understood that some things cannot be hurried toward, only met. I told him what I needed. He nodded before I finished the sentence. I called Margaret Ellis from the kitchen, while Diana helped me carry the portable case from the library, the one I had loaded that morning, with the 1987 contract, the quarry files, the recording from today's session, and the hard drive copies of the 2021 footage. My phone rang 3 times before Margaret picked up. "I've been expecting your call," she said. No surprise in her voice? None. "Rose told you this day would come," I said. "She told me exactly what to do when it did." Margaret had already spoken with a contact at the FBI field office in New Orleans, a white-collar crimes coordinator she had reached through a referral Rose had arranged 2 years ago. The office was expecting us. She gave me a name, Special Agent Robert Callahan. We were on the road by 1:45 in the afternoon. Walter stood at the rear gate as we pulled out one hand, resting on the gatepost, in the particular way of a man marking a threshold. I stopped the car and rolled down the window. "Come with us," I said. "I've looked after this place for 15 years, he said. "I'll look after it one more night." He looked past me at Diana in the passenger seat, and something in his expression settled the specific gravity of a person passing a weight to someone else's hands and trusting they are strong enough. "Go." I drove. On the highway south, with the flat Mississippi afternoon spreading out around us and New Orleans still 3 hours ahead, Diana talked. Not the careful, measured telling of that morning in the kitchen. This was the other kind, the kind that comes when a decision has been made, and the body understands that the keeping is over. Connor had made calls the previous evening, she said. She had heard fragments of conversation about the property, a name she didn't recognize, a phrase she had understood precisely, before the end of the week. He had arranged for someone to go to the manor. She did not know how many people or what their instructions were, but she knew Connor well enough to understand that when he said before the end of the week, he meant it as a deadline, not a preference. I kept my eyes on the road and my hands steady on the wheel, and I thought about Walter alone in that cottage, 200 meters from the rear gate, with his bad leg and his 15 years of patience, and whatever Rose had thought to leave him by way of preparation. I thought about the roses he brought into the house every morning. I drove faster. The FBI field office in New Orleans occupied a building off Leon C. Simon Boulevard, north of the lake. We arrived at 4:53 in the afternoon. The lobby was fluorescent and quiet, staffed by a uniformed officer at a desk who took our names and made a call without expression. We waited 8 minutes. Then a door opened. Special Agent Robert Callahan was 45 years old, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had learned economy, not unfriendly, but accustomed to reserving warmth for moments that had earned it. He shook my hand, shook Diana's, and led us to a conference room with a long table and a whiteboard that still had case notations on it in dry erase marker. I opened the case on the table. I had laid out evidence before in depositions and committee reviews, in the rare situations where a medical error required documentation and accountability. The principles are the same. Present in sequence, label everything. Let the material speak before you interpret it. I set down the 1987 contract first, then the quarry files with Rose's annotations, then the hard drive with the 2021 footage, then the recording from that morning. Diana placed her USB beside mine without being asked. Callahan did not interrupt. He read the contract cover page, reviewed the quarry file annotations, and listened to 40 seconds of the morning's recording. Connor's voice, low and deliberate. "You're alone here. No one knows where you are. Don't make this more complicated than it has to be." He looked up. "The mineral rights clause alone triggers federal jurisdiction," he said. "The FCPA exposure from the Forsyth transaction is significant. And this recording," he touched the drive, "combined with the witness statement, changes the evidentiary picture considerably." Diana signed the witness declaration form with both hands wrapped around the pen. Her signature was smaller than her normal handwriting, the letters pressed hard into the page. She did not ask to stop. Callahan was reviewing the chain of custody documentation when his phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen, then picked it up. His expression did not change in any dramatic way, but something behind his eyes did the shift of a person absorbing information that requires a decision. He set the phone down and looked at me. "Do you have someone at the Reed Manor property right now?" I was already standing. "Local sheriff's office received a call," he said. "Attempted unauthorized entry. There was a warning shot." He paused. The caller identified himself as a caretaker. I looked at Diana. She looked at me. "Walter, a doctor learns not to let emotion interfere with decisions in a crisis." I had practiced that discipline for 40 years. I knew how to stand in a room where everything was going wrong and keep my hands steady and my voice level, because the people around me needed that steadiness more than they needed my honest reaction. When Callahan described the warning shot at Reed Manor, I stopped being a doctor. I was simply an old man standing in a federal building in New Orleans, afraid for the last person Rose had trusted to keep her work safe. Callahan held up one hand. "The shot was Walter's," he said. "Single round fired into the ground. He called 911 before he fired and stayed on the line throughout. The two individuals attempting entry are in custody. Mr. Gaines is uninjured." I sat back down. Diana let out a breath beside me that she had apparently been holding since the name left my lips. The account came together in pieces over the next half hour. The two men Connor had retained had arrived at the Reed Manor gate after dark, equipped with bolt cutters, and the confidence of people told a property was unoccupied. Walter had been watching the gate camera from the monitoring room since we left. When the headlights appeared on the gravel track, he called 911, gave the dispatcher his name and location, and went to the rear garden. He fired one round from a licensed rifle into the dirt 6 feet to his left. Then he stood in the garden and waited. The two men were still working the gate chain when the Adams County Sheriff's Department arrived. Walter was in the middle of describing their clothing to the dispatcher. I thought about the man I had met 4 days ago, in a garden full of red roses, the careful, unhurried way he moved around his bad leg, the weight he carried in every sentence, the 15 years of staying in a place he had been asked to stay without being told the full reason why. Rose had chosen him because she understood what he was made of. Standing in that FBI conference room, I understood it too. FBI agents coordinated with Mississippi State Police and reached the property within 90 minutes. Connor was located at the Magnolia Inn on Silver Street in downtown Natchez at 9:22 in the evening, midway through a call to his attorney. He did not resist. The search warrants for Reed Construction and all registered subsidiaries, including Magnolia Land Holdings and the Delaware Shell Companies, were signed by a federal magistrate at 10:47 p.m. Agents entered offices in 4 cities before midnight. Callahan delivered each piece of information with the economy of a man accustomed to situations that require precision over comfort. I received each one the same way. Connor in custody. Reed construction frozen. The thing Rose had spent 20 years building toward was now in the hands of people whose job was to finish it. At 11:15, I stepped into the hallway and called Walter. He answered on the second ring. "I'm all right," he said before I could ask. "The Roses are all right, too." I stood in the hallway for a long moment. After the call ended, my back against the wall, phone still in my hand. 15 years of waiting, of monthly bank transfers and quiet maintenance, and a copper key held in reserve, and the thing he had been asked to protect was still standing. Rose had known, when she chose him, exactly what she was choosing. Not just a caretaker. A man who had already lost everything once to Connor Reed and had decided quietly and without announcement that he would not let it happen again. I went back in and sat beside Diana. She had not moved from her chair. The paper coffee cup was cold in front of her. She was looking at the surface of the table with the fixed attention of someone whose mind is working through something that her face has not yet fully processed. "Did Rose know I would do this?" she asked. It was not quite the question it sounded like. She was not asking whether Rose had predicted her choices. She was asking something closer to, did someone who knew the whole picture believe I was capable of this? After 9 years of being told in 100 small and large ways that her judgment could not be trusted, she needed to know that someone had looked at her clearly and seen something worth counting on. "She knew everything," I said, "including the things she didn't tell us." Diana looked at the table. Something in her face changed slowly, not relief exactly, but the beginning of what comes after a long effort finally completes. The loosening of a person who has been braced for impact and is only now beginning to believe the ground beneath them might hold. She had driven to Reed Manor alone. She had walked through a side gate with a USB drive in her jacket pocket and introduced herself to a man she barely knew, and placed 2 years of her life on a conference table in a federal building. Whatever she had believed about herself before this week, she knew something different now. We sat together in the quiet of the conference room, while agents worked through the night in 4 cities. A wall clock moved in small, indifferent increments. Somewhere across 3 states, search teams were walking through filing rooms and server closets with warrants in hand, pulling the records that Connor had spent 37 years assuming would never be examined. I thought about Rose in the hidden room behind the library wall, working by lamplight, in a house that most people thought was empty, carrying the weight of it alone, and deciding year after year that the truth was worth the cost of keeping it. Callahan came back at 11:42. He set a legal pad and a folder on the table and sat across from me with the posture of a man who has cleared the preliminary obstacles and is now arriving at the work that matters most. "There's one element we need to establish clearly for the evidentiary chain," he said. "It concerns a patient at Asheville Memorial Hospital. October 2009. A man named Marcus Webb." I looked at him. "You were the attending physician on his final night," Callahan said. "We have the hospital records, the original incident report you filed, and the withdrawal notation. What we need is your direct account. What Mr. Webb said to you in your own words, as a witnessed oral statement for the record." He set a pen on the legal pad and pushed it toward me. I thought about a hand closing around my wrist in the dark. I thought about a voice that was barely sound moving against the noise of a hospital at midnight. I thought about 15 years of carrying something I had been told not to trust, setting it down each morning and picking it back up each night, because I could never quite convince myself it wasn't real. Rose had known it was real. She had written it in a letter she never sent, and kept it in a room she never told me about, waiting for the moment when it would finally be safe to say out loud. That moment was now. I picked up the pen. I'm ready, I said. There are questions a person is afraid to ask, not because they don't know the answer, but because they understand that the answer once spoken aloud will change everything permanently. That night in New Orleans, sitting across from Agent Callahan with a legal pad in front of me and a pen in my hand, I was finally ready to let it change. I told him everything. I told him about a room with the quality of a room where someone is dying, a hand closing around my wrist, a voice that was barely sound read construction, not an accident. Files, the Lexington office. I told him about the report I filed the following morning, and the report I withdrew 2 weeks later, and the specific words Connor had used at the kitchen table when he explained why I should. I told him about 15 years of convincing myself that my memory might be the unreliable thing in the room. Callahan wrote steadily and did not interrupt once. When I finished, he set down his pen and looked at me for a moment, not with sympathy exactly, but with the particular attention of a man recalibrating what he understands about the weight a person can carry for 15 years and still walk upright. "Thank you," he said. "That fills the last gap." The federal trial began in New Orleans in November 2024. I will not describe every day of it because most of what happened in that courtroom was the careful, methodical work of evidence presented in sequence, which is, in my experience, how the most important truths are finally established. Not in dramatic confrontations, but in documents and timestamps and the quiet accumulation of facts that cannot all be wrong at once. Walter testified for 2 hours. He described the written objection he had submitted in August 2009, the termination notice that followed, and the phone call from Marcus Webb's wife on the morning of the collapse. He did not shake. He did not look at Connor once. When the defense attorney attempted to challenge his recollection, Walter waited until the question was fully finished, and then answered it in exactly the same tone he had used for everything else. The tone of a man who stopped being afraid of this particular truth a long time ago. Diana testified for 4 hours. The USB recording was played in full. Connor's voice, the low, deliberate voice I had heard in the parlor at Reed Manor, stripped of warmth and entirely itself filled the courtroom, while the room sat in complete silence. Every person in that room heard what I had heard, a man speaking to his father, as though his father were an obstacle to be managed, rather than a person to be answered to. The 2021 footage from the Reed Manor camera system was admitted into evidence and shown to the jury. Connor moving through the entrance hall, making his phone call, standing in front of the fireplace with his jaw set and his hands open at his sides. I testified for 3 hours. I said Marcus Webb's name clearly in a federal courtroom into the official record for the first time in 15 years. I described the room, the rain, the hour, the specific quality of his voice when he found the last of his strength to say what he needed to say. I did not embellish. I did not need to. The facts assembled in sequence were sufficient. Connor James Reed was convicted on 19 counts violations of the Federal Mineral Leasing Act, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, conspiracy obstruction of justice, and 5 counts of involuntary manslaughter, corresponding to the 5 workers who died at Quarry Site 7 on September 3, 2009. He was sentenced to 31 years in a federal facility. He will be 79 years old when he is eligible for release. The families of the 5 workers were present for sentencing. I did not speak to them. I did not feel that I had earned the right to, but I saw their faces when the sentence was read, the particular stillness of people receiving something they had stopped believing would ever arrive, and I will carry that with me for whatever time I have left. Dr. Raymond Holt surrendered his medical license permanently in October 2024 and was charged separately with conspiracy to commit fraud. Reed Construction's assets, including the Magnolia Land Holdings portfolio, were frozen pending forfeiture proceedings. The families of the 5 workers were designated primary beneficiaries of the compensation fund. I returned to Reed Manor in early 2025 Walter was in the rear garden when I arrived, moving along the rose bed, with the same unhurried attention he had given it every morning for 15 years. He looked up when he heard my car on the gravel, raised one hand, in a gesture that required no words, and returned to his work. Some things do not need to be said between people who have already said everything that matters. I went into the library. The room was exactly as I had left it. Bookshelves, dust covers, the pale winter light coming through the shuttered windows in long, thin bars. I walked to the end of the room and stood in front of the fireplace. I placed my hand flat against the cold marble of the mantel and felt the stone beneath my palm, solid, unchanged, patient. I did not open it. There was nothing left inside that I needed to retrieve. Everything Rose had kept in that room had already done what she built it to do. The evidence had been heard. The names had been spoken. The record existed now in a federal courthouse in New Orleans, permanent and beyond revision. I stood there for a long time in the quiet of the house, with the sound of Walter moving through the garden, coming through the window, and the January light falling across. The bookshelves where her handwriting was still in the margins of the books she had studied for 20 years. All those hours she had spent in this room alone, building something she might not live to see completed, and she had done it anyway, because she believed the truth was worth the cost of carrying it. I understand now, Rose, I said quietly. I understand. Outside, the roses were red against the pale winter light, the same color they had always been, patient and deliberate, waiting for the right season to open. I am 74 years old. I have delivered difficult news across a desk more times than I can count. But I have never told a harder truth than this one for 15 years. I knew something was wrong, and I chose silence. Do not do what I did. Do not wait 15 years to speak the name of someone who deserved justice. Speak sooner. The longer you carry a truth alone, the heavier it becomes, and the more damage the silence does to everyone around you. I believe, and I say this as a man who has sat beside enough deathbeds to mean it, that God places certain truths in front of us more than once. He placed Marcus Webb in that emergency room. He placed Rose's letters in my hands. He was more patient with me than I deserved. This is a family story that took 20 years to finish. Not because the truth was hidden, but because the people who held it were waiting for the right moment to be heard. Every family story like this one begins with someone choosing to stay and collect the evidence instead of walking away. And every family story like this one reminds me that love at its most serious is not a feeling, it is a decision made quietly over decades. This is also a dad revenge story, not built on anger, but on grief turned into testimony. A dad revenge that took a federal courtroom and 31 years of sentencing to complete. And if you think a dad revenge built on evidence and truth is less powerful than one built on fury, I would respectfully disagree. My personal opinion, justice does not always arrive on time, but it arrives. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Thank you sincerely for staying with us until the very end. The stories ahead contain fictional elements crafted solely to illuminate truths worth reflecting on. If that is not the journey you are looking for, we completely respect that. Please find content that serves you better. But if you are still here, we are grateful you stayed.